How can I check? Shoutout sa ating mga viewers. So, viewers natin sa YouTube. At saka yun. Well, check natin ating reporting for today, for next week. Sa ating doctoral class. At ang gumawa na aking report ay ang ating classmate. Wait. Large. Save the files. Definitely. Okay. Save. Keyboard. Production. Study net is okay. Thank you. Ano ba? Nagkaiba. Mas nagkaiba doon siya. Okay. Save files. Check my report. Check. Beware, Vicks inhaler.
Blockbuster was an entertainment company that was a household name from the late 80s to the early 2000s. They carried movies, video games, and music for people of all ages to rent. Walking up and down the aisles of Blockbuster to look for a movie everyone could enjoy, or maybe check out the new selections section, became an unspoken weekend tradition for many families across America. In 1997, Reed Hastings, a Silicon Valley veteran, was inspired to start Netflix by his frustration with a $40 late fee charge he received from Blockbuster for returning a movie after its scheduled return date. He entered the market of movie rentals with a new business model concept, subscription-based rentals. Customers would pay a flat monthly rate to select as many movies as they wanted and return them whenever they were done. The company devised algorithms to give viewers suggestions on which movies they might enjoy based on previous selections. This concept did more than just tweak the business model of their competitors. It flipped an entire industry on its head. Netflix emphasized looking ahead to the future of the industry by incorporating innovation and technology into its process. This is the impact of leaders stepping back and making sure they have a vision for their organization, to be able to recognize future challenges and opportunities that may present themselves and not get left behind. In 2000, Netflix approached Blockbuster with a proposition to buy them out for $50 million, but Blockbuster refused that or any other kind of deal. Instead, they focused money and resources on their inventory and creating a positive in-store experience for their customers. They were at the height of their power and viewed Netflix's attempts to modernize the industry as a fad. Unfortunately, their leadership didn't have the vision to see how their disregard for improving their product would be their eventual downfall. In 2007, Netflix switched its primary business model from a DVD rental subscription to a streaming service. With this move, its customer base grew by 20% that year, taking more of the market share. Blockbuster realized too late, due to its leadership's lack of vision, that it was now dealing with an emergency, as its customers increasingly depended on a competitor for their movie needs. In fact, Blockbuster even attempted to create its own online platform, but was too far behind at that point. The effort faltered, and Blockbuster went bankrupt in 2010. Netflix has gone on to not only revolutionize video rentals, but alter how people view media overall. The company has grown from solely providing movies and TV shows to producing them. Netflix has produced award-winning movies like Marriage Story, Don't Look Up, and Roma, although they are probably even more famous for their hit TV shows like House of Cards, Stranger Things, The Queen's Gambit, Daredevil, and Squid Game. By creating this content, Netflix has become a cultural pillar for millions of people and has set itself up to become the primary source of media entertainment for many around the world. By the end of 2017, they had over 130 million subscribers and were operating in 190 different countries around the world. The leadership at Netflix understood how vision is a key component for staying relevant in a time when circumstances are changing rapidly. Those organizations with plan-oriented, forward-thinking leaders will be able to stay ahead of potential issues instead of panicking as they appear. In any organization, the importance of having a visionary leader cannot be overstated. A leader's ability to craft and communicate a compelling vision for the future is crucial for the long-term success and sustainability of the organization. While visions may not always lead to instant success, their value lies in the long-term impacts they can have on shaping the organization's direction, fostering innovation, and empowering its members to seize future opportunities. By defining a compelling vision, leaders inspire their people and align them towards a common goal. This shared understanding fosters unity, collaboration, and a sense of belonging among your people. When everyone is working towards a shared vision, individual efforts become more purposeful and cohesive, leading to improved performance and outcomes. A well-crafted vision acts as a guiding beacon, helping the organization navigate through challenges and uncertainties. This vision enables leaders to anticipate potential obstacles, adapt to market dynamics, and make informed decisions that align with the long-term goals of the organization. By having a clear sense of direction, leaders can avoid reactionary decision-making and instead proactively steer the organization towards success. Additionally, a visionary leader stimulates innovation within the organization. By articulating a forward-thinking vision, leaders inspire their employees to think creatively and explore new ideas. A vision that emphasizes growth, progress, and adaptability encourages individuals to challenge the status quo, experiment with novel approaches, and embrace change. This mindset of innovation fosters a culture of continuous improvement and keeps the organization at the forefront of industry trends, enabling it to seize emerging opportunities and stay competitive in a dynamic marketplace. A vision provides a framework for future-oriented decision-making. Leaders who have a well-defined vision can make strategic choices that align with the long-term interests of the organization, rather than being swayed by short-term gains or fads. By considering the long-term impacts of their decision, Leaders can make choices that are consistent with the organization's core values and objectives. Was an entertainment company that was a household name from the late 80s to the early 2000s. They carried movies, video games, and music for people of all ages to rent. Walking up and down the aisles of Blockbuster to look for a movie everyone could enjoy, or maybe check out the new selections section, became an unspoken weekend tradition for many families across America. In 1997, Reed Hastings, a Silicon Valley veteran, was inspired to start Netflix by his frustration with a $40 late fee charge he received from Blockbuster for returning a movie after its scheduled return date. He entered the market of movie rentals with a new business model concept, subscription-based rentals. Customers would pay a flat monthly rate to select as many movies as they wanted and return them whenever they were done. The company devised algorithms to give viewers suggestions on which movies they might enjoy based on previous selections. This concept did more than just tweak the business model of their competitors. It flipped an entire industry on its head. Netflix emphasized looking ahead to the future of the industry by incorporating innovation and technology into its process. This is the impact of leaders stepping back and making sure they have a vision for their organization, to be able to recognize future challenges and opportunities that may present themselves and not get left behind. In 2000, Netflix approached Blockbuster with a proposition to buy them out for $15 million, but Blockbuster refused that or any other kind of deal. Instead, they focused money and resources on their inventory and creating a positive in-store experience for their customers. They were at the height of their power and viewed Netflix's attempts to modernize the industry as a fad. Unfortunately, their leadership didn't have the vision to see how their disregard for improving their product would be their eventual downfall. In 2007, Netflix switched its primary business model from a DVD rental subscription to a streaming service. With this move, its customer base grew by 20% that year, taking more of the market share. Blockbuster realized too late, due to its leadership's lack of vision, that it was now dealing with an emergency, as its customers increasingly depended on a competitor for their movie needs. In fact, Blockbuster even attempted to create its own online platform, but was too far behind at that point. The effort faltered, and Blockbuster went bankrupt in 2010. Netflix has gone on to not only revolutionize video rentals, but alter how people view media overall. The company has grown from solely providing movies and TV shows to producing them. Netflix has produced award-winning movies like Marriage Story, Don't Look Up, and Roma, although they are probably even more famous for their hit TV shows like House of Cards, Stranger Things, The Queen's Gambit, Daredevil, and Squid Game. By creating this content, Netflix has become a cultural pillar for millions of people and has set itself up to become the primary source of media entertainment for many around the world. By the end of 2017, they had over 130 million subscribers and were operating in 190 different countries around the world. The leadership at Netflix understood how vision is a key component for staying relevant in a time when circumstances are changing rapidly. Those organizations with plan-oriented, forward-thinking leaders will be able to stay ahead of potential issues instead of panicking as they appear. In any organization, the importance of having a visionary leader cannot be overstated. A leader's ability to craft and communicate a compelling vision for the future is crucial for the long-term success and sustainability of the organization. While visions may not always lead to instant success, their value lies in the long-term impacts they can have on shaping the organization's direction, fostering innovation, and empowering its members to seize future opportunities. By defining a compelling vision, leaders inspire their people and align them towards a common goal. This shared understanding fosters unity, collaboration, and a sense of belonging among your people. When everyone is working towards a shared vision, individual efforts become more purposeful and cohesive, leading to improved performance and outcomes. A well-crafted vision acts as a guiding beacon, helping the organization navigate through challenges and uncertainties. This vision enables leaders to anticipate potential obstacles, adapt to market dynamics, and make informed decisions that align with the long-term goals of the organization. By having a clear sense of direction, leaders can avoid reactionary decision-making and instead proactively steer the organization towards success. Additionally, a visionary leader stimulates innovation within the organization. By articulating a forward-thinking vision, leaders inspire their employees to think creatively and explore new ideas. A vision that emphasizes growth, progress, and adaptability encourages individuals to challenge the status quo, experiment with novel approaches, and embrace change. This mindset of innovation fosters a culture of continuous improvement and keeps the organization at the forefront of industry trends, enabling it to seize emerging opportunities and stay competitive in a dynamic marketplace. A vision provides a framework for future-oriented decision-making. Leaders who have a well-defined vision can make strategic choices that align with the long-term interests of the organization, rather than being swayed by short-term gains or fads. By considering the long-term impacts of their decisions, leaders can make choices that are consistent with the organization's core values and objectives. A visionary leader empowers their team to seize opportunities that have not yet presented themselves. By painting a vivid picture of the organization's future, leaders inspire their people to think beyond the present and explore uncharted territories. All right, I have a challenge for you from today's lesson. I want each of you to answer the question, do you have a current, well-crafted vision for what you expect your organization to achieve? Do your people know that vision? Make sure to put your answer in the comments so we can all learn from each other. Till next time, keep on learning. Thank you for watching. Much of what I go over in my lessons can be found in my book, Mission First, People Always, which is available for purchase through the link in the description of the video. If you enjoyed today's video and want to watch more leadership lessons, then be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Ma'am, uwi po kayo.
Pasensya na boss. Di kasi kami taga rito eh.
Nagasan ba kayo?
Uwi ako.
Bakit ka? Bakit kung pupunta mo pa ako?
Lisensya.
Sus, lapit lang. Ako nga taga
Kuya, sa Jupiter lang po.
No excitement? New Lucky Chicken Chili Mansi. Chicken Mommy with Chili Mansi. Sarap together! Pili na! New Lucky Chicken Chili Mansi Mommy. Sarap!
The history of Netflix is a fascinating tale of innovation, transformation, and adaptation. To fully understand it, we must revisit its humble beginnings, observe its technological evolution, and examine the strategies that made it a global entertainment giant. Humble beginnings. Netflix was founded on August 29, 1997, in Scotts Valley, California, by Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph. The idea came from Hastings' personal experience of having to pay a significant late fee for returning a VHS tape. This incident inspired him to create a more convenient and accessible movie rental service. Initially, Netflix operated as a DVD rental service by mail. Customers placed orders online and received the discs at their homes. Upon returning the DVDs, customers could request new titles. This business model differed from traditional video rental stores, like Blockbuster, by not imposing strict return deadlines or late fees. Instead, Netflix offered a monthly subscription fee that allowed users to rent as many DVDs as they wanted. Early challenges and innovations. In its early years, Netflix faced significant financial difficulties. In 2000, the founders tried to sell the company to Blockbuster for $50 million, but the offer was declined. Despite this, Netflix persevered and continued to refine its business model. One of the critical innovations was the introduction of a movie recommendation system based on algorithms. This system, called Cinematch, analyzed users' preferences and suggested titles they would likely enjoy. This technology not only improved the user experience, but also significantly increased subscriber retention. The digital shift. In 2007, Netflix took a decisive step by launching its video streaming service. This shift represented a radical transformation in media consumption, allowing users to watch movies and TV shows directly on their devices without waiting for DVD delivery. Initially, the streaming catalog was limited. but the convenience of the service quickly attracted a growing user base. The transition to streaming was not without challenges. Netflix had to negotiate content licenses with Hollywood studios and content providers, often at high costs. However, this bet on digital technology proved visionary, as high-speed internet became more accessible and the demand for online entertainment grew exponentially. International expansion. In 2010, Netflix began expanding its services beyond the United States. Canada was the first international market, followed by Latin America and the Caribbean in 2011. In 2012, Netflix reached the United Kingdom, Ireland, and several other European countries. Each new region presented unique challenges, from negotiating local content rights to adapting the service to the cultural preferences of different markets. International expansion was a crucial part of Netflix's growth strategy. By entering new markets, the company not only increased its subscriber base, but also diversified its revenue sources. This strategy helped Netflix mitigate the risks associated with domestic market saturation and compete in an increasingly competitive global landscape. Original content production. One of the most transformative moments in Netflix's history was the decision to invest in original content. In 2013, the company released its first original series, House of Cards, produced by David Fincher and starring Kevin Spacey. The series was a critical and commercial success, signaling Netflix's arrival as a significant force in content production. The success of House of Cards was followed by other high-profile original productions, including Orange is the New Black, Stranger Things, and The Crown. Producing original content allowed Netflix to differentiate its service in a crowded market and attract new subscribers with exclusives unavailable anywhere else. Challenges and competition. As Netflix grew, so did the competition in the streaming market. Traditional media companies like Disney, Warner Media, and NBC Universal began launching their own streaming services, pulling their content from Netflix's platform. Additionally, new competitors like Amazon Prime Video, Hulu, and HBO Max entered the market, offering robust catalogs and investments in original content. To face these challenges, Netflix continued to invest heavily in original content and explore new international markets. The company also began diversifying its portfolio, including documentaries, stand-up comedy shows, and reality programs. Moreover, Netflix invested in technology to improve the user experience, such as 4K and HDR streaming, as well as download functionalities for offline viewing. The pandemic era, the COVID-19 pandemic, which began in 2020, had a profound impact on the entertainment industry. With millions of people at home due to lockdown measures, the demand for streaming services soared. Netflix, as a market leader, saw a significant increase in subscribers and viewing time. However, the pandemic also brought challenges. The production of new content was halted due to filming restrictions, leading to delays and interruptions in the release of new series and movies. Netflix had to adapt quickly, adjusting its operations and finding safe ways to continue producing content. Cultural impact and future. Over the years, Netflix has not only revolutionized how we consume entertainment, but also had a profound impact on popular culture. Series and films released on the platform have become global phenomena, sparking discussions and trends worldwide. The company has also played a crucial role in promoting diversity and inclusion, investing in content that represents different cultures, ethnicities, and identities. The future of Netflix promises to be equally dynamic. The company continues to explore new technologies, such as augmented and virtual reality, and expand its global presence. The competition in the streaming market remains intense, but Netflix has demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation and innovation. In conclusion, the history of Netflix is a narrative of vision, resilience, and transformation. From its roots as a DVD rental service by mail to its current status as a global streaming giant, the company exemplifies the ability to adapt to technological changes and market demands. Netflix's journey continues to be a source of inspiration and a case study on how innovation can transform an entire industry.
Hello guys, ako si Alvin Patrimonio at welcome sa Code Speech.
So yun guys. Excuse me. Ang pinapanood ko ngayon guys is yung innovation and strategic decision making kasi I have a report this coming Wednesday. So yung yung topic ko kasi yung innovation ng Netflix, no? From ano pala siya, no? Noong 1990 parang from ang kasi yung may-ari kasi niya is parang ganito. Na-frustrate na kasi nga, 'di ba nung mga 80s, 90s parang umakita tayo ng sa TV ng mga movie, gano'n. Diba nung 80s or 90s, ang mga time kasi noon, pag kailangan gusto mo manood ng movie, arkila ka ng tape, then gano'n. Parang gano'n nangyayari. Kung aware kayo sa Video City nung araw, gano'n nangyayari. Ngayon, yung may-ari ng Netflix, na-frustrate siya kasi parang na-late siya ng soli ng tape. Tapos na-charge siya ng Blockbuster ng $40. Yun yung simula ng Netflix kasi gumawa siya sarili niyang company na yung ang pinaka main goal niya is magkaroon ng convenience yung tao na nandito na agad yung movie natin, gano'n. Kaya gumawa siya ng sarili niya ng diskarte. Kasi sila yung nagde-deliver ng mga movie. Tapos monthly ang bayad mo sa kanya, kahit anong klaseng movie pwede mo. Nagkaroon ng problema, nagkaroon ng konting challenge kasi nga siguro gano'n. Kasi innovate sila hanggang sa nakuha nila yung ganito, yung online streaming. So ita-report ko siya this coming Wednesday, kaya that's why pinapanood ko siya. Ngayon, napanood natin yung innovation ng Apple. Innovation ng Apple products ngayon. Kasi yung Apple, yung isa sa mga Apple yung nag-innovate na nag-success. Alright? So, let's watch movie. Ang kasi dyan, pinaka paliwanag dyan is, as a leader, you should be a visionary. Ngayon, panoorin natin guys yung innovation ng Apple. I have an iPad. I'm using iPad. So, ngayon lang ako nag-use ng iPad and nararamdaman ko yung convenience niya. So, isa sa mga saksing buhay na kailangan you have a very good critical decision making. Okay? Strategic decision making para mag-success yung company.
Apple has been the most valuable publicly traded company in the world.
They were the first to make computers look sexy.
With its revolutionary products and services, it's transformed the way we live and shaped the culture of the 21st century.
You can't walk down the street without seeing someone wearing an Apple Watch or using an iPhone or an iPad.
But things haven't always gone to plan for Apple.
Apple was dying. They weren't making it at all. It was a company in great turmoil.
He destroyed everything I spent 10 years working for.
Apple's on the verge of bankruptcy. Anybody could tell, gee, there's a lot of liabilities on this balance sheet.
They were bleeding money. They couldn't compete with cheaper competitors.
It's just losing astronomical amounts of money.
This is the story of how Apple very nearly crumbled, told by people who witnessed the company's fall firsthand and were close to the man who managed to turn it into one of the world's most valuable brands. With an annual turnover of over 200 billion US dollars, 123,000 employees, over 500 stores, and over 1 billion products in use globally, Apple is one of the world's most successful businesses. Its genius for innovative design, disruptive technology, and marketing has built a customer base that reveres Apple with almost religious fanaticism.
I'm a lifer. I'm an Apple lifer.
就常用的都是苹果吗？
所有的 iPhone，我每年换一个。
Everyone in my family also uses Apple. It's easy once you start with the Apple products.
It's the #1 company in the world. I hope I will stay with Apple forever.
The story of Apple is a roller coaster drama that took the company to the brink of bankruptcy and on to global domination. But it all began in a garage in Los Altos, California, where two 20-something computer nerds, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, formed a company making basic kit computers on April Fool's Day 1976.
Steve Wozniak was always, early on, he was the kind of the technical brains behind the Apple computer, the engineering kind of brains behind Apple. Steve Jobs was the slick marketer. He was the person who thought, you know, we can't just sell this to a small group of geeks who are interested in buying personal computers. This is something that could appeal to everyone.
With a $250,000 US investment from Mike Markula, a former executive of Intel, Jobs and Wozniak launched the Apple II computer.
The Apple II, small, inexpensive, simple to use.
One of the world's first microcomputers, it had a built-in keyboard and offered high-resolution color graphics and sound. It was designed to look more like an appliance than a traditional bulky business computer.
Apple pretty much was one of the inventors of the personal computer industry, was one of the first companies to introduce one of these products. The Apple II was Apple's first kind of breakthrough hit. It was launched in 1977, and some version of it wound up running until 1993, which gives you an idea of just how big a product this was.
Thanks to the Apple II, Apple's yearly sales grew from 774,000 to 118 million US dollars, an average annual growth rate of 533%.
They were growing very, very rapidly as a company. I mean, Apple was founded in a garage, and within a few years, it's employing thousands of people.
In December 1980, Apple was listed on the Nasdaq stock market. The shares sold out almost immediately. Instantly, about 300 millionaires were created. Steve Jobs, the largest shareholder, made 217 million US dollars. In 4 years, Apple had grown exponentially. Steve Wozniak continued to work in engineering until a plane accident and disillusionment with the increasingly corporate ambitions of the company led to his departure in 1985.
I go to business meetings and they're all sitting there in three-piece suits. It's a large business, there's a lot of dollars involved. The people who have come out of school trained to run and manage business is the key element today, and that's where most of the creativity is going.
Steve Jobs became Apple's lead visionary.
He had this vision to build great products that would change the world, and he always called them appliances.
This is something that every housewife will ultimately be a programmer. Well, as you see from the Apple, it weighs about 12 pounds, and one of the nice things about handling it is if you don't like what it's doing, you can throw it out the window.
He didn't call them computers, and he wanted to build appliances that people would put in their homes and would look at fondly from a design perspective, but that they would also be incredibly useful. He wanted things to be so easy to use that you just didn't even feel like you were using them, that they just became part of you.
has been part of Paul Mark Davis's life for over 20 years. His unofficial Apple Museum in London has an almost unparalleled collection of vintage machines.
Apple machines were so much more beautiful than the PC alternative. There was no comparable model outside of Apple. Here goes nothing. So I kind of got all of my old Macs out that I've been sort of collecting over the years and put them all together, all these various machines from different decades. I wanted to have every single machine. Isn't that amazing? It's working fine. This is a real mixture of stuff. I mean, there's the Apple Lisa up there, there's a Apple II.
One of the most notorious objects in Paul's collection lurks in a special place.
Okay.
Right above his bathroom.
The Apple III. It is a huge, useless, non-working lump. I mean, most of the machines in here do work, and in my defense, this probably stopped working about 6 weeks after it was bought.
The Apple III was launched in 1980, and hopes were that it would emulate the success of the Apple II.
My Apple is my friend.
But it went into the history books as the company's first big failure.
The Apple III was disastrous. Early on, it ran into technical problems, and one of Apple's official solutions for it was that you should lift the computer up about 3 or 4 inches and drop it, because this would hopefully reseat the chips inside it. And so that's a failure.
Wounded by the disaster of the Apple III, there was worse news to come. In August 1981, IBM launched its personal computer, or PC. It was the opening salvo in the PC versus Apple war that would rage for decades.
The IBM personal computer, coming to selected stores across the country.
You get giants like IBM, which then come along and think, oh, this is a fast-growing product category, there's probably some money to be made there. So Apple faces more competition. So I would say that that's probably the main challenge that they were facing at the time.
Aware that Apple desperately needed a new hit, Steve Jobs set up a group of 100 people to work on a top-secret project. Andy Cunningham was one of the chosen few.
He's hand-selected his team of 100 people, and he only allowed a very small number of outside people to be part of that team. And we had special badges to get into the building, and you were not allowed in there if you weren't one of those people. So you were living with these people, going through the process of working with Steve Jobs, which was grueling and difficult. He knew what he wanted in his head, and he would communicate that to you, and if you didn't make it happen, he'd basically scream and yell, and sometimes throw things and insult you if you couldn't do it.
All of the images you are about to see on the large screen will be generated by what's in that bag.
Knowing that Apple's fortunes were riding on it, Jobs pushed his team of 100 to create a computer that he believed would change the world, the Macintosh. Launched in January 1984, the Macintosh was the first mass-marketed computer to have a mouse and an on-screen desktop interface. All packaged in a radical form factor.
You could consider the Macintosh Steve's baby. That was his child. Absolutely no difference between that product and a child. But one day I asked him, I said, what are you trying to do with the Macintosh product and its relationship with its users? And he said, I want to put a mother in every box. I want people to open up the Macintosh box, and I want them to feel like this product is taking care of them, and not that they have to take care of it.
It was the first computer that felt truly intuitive. It was the first computer that meant that you could use it without training. That's the revolution in computers.
The real genius of Macintosh is that you don't have to be a genius.
The advertising was compelling, but the Macintosh failed to do the one thing it needed to do. Get people to buy it.
We realized that nobody's buying it. They loved the ad, they loved Steve Jobs, they loved talking about it in the press, but they weren't buying the product.
The Macintosh was too expensive for struggling creatives and too unorthodox for businesses who preferred more established rivals like IBM.
people who work in corporate jobs, who go to work every day in suits and ties, it wasn't attractive to business people. They're not attracted by that, by that image. So it's almost like we mispositioned the product, if you will.
The Macintosh struggled commercially, and this drove a wedge between Steve Jobs and John Scully, the CEO who Jobs had lured from Pepsi in 1983 to bring structure to the infamously unstructured Apple.
I think when John joined the company, it was like a miracle for everyone because people saw him as adult supervision, including Steve. And that he has the famous quote, you know, do you want to go on selling sugar water to kids or do you want to come and change the world? And John, of course, chose the decision to come and change the world. And I think John thought that he would come and play a typical CEO role. You know, he had come from Pepsi, and that was a very well-structured consumer company. And he goes to Apple, and it's not very well structured at all. And Steve was still making all the big decisions. And it was very difficult, I think, for John to deal with that. And Macintosh was failing. It's not like he launched this product and all of a sudden they were making gazillions of dollars on it. That was not happening at all. It was costing the company a ton of money to have that product. And Steve was just insistent, we must make this go, this must happen. And John was ready to pull the plug, you know. No, I don't think so. I don't think we need a Macintosh. It's killing us.
Without the success of the Macintosh in business, we couldn't afford the huge investment we had in research and development.
It was crunch time for Apple, and a battle ensued between Scully and Jobs.
Steve Jobs actually tried to drum up support to sort of wrestle control away from John Scully. John Scully, who came from a very corporate background, was maybe far better sort of as a corporate infighter than Steve Jobs, was able to win that tussle.
The Apple board sided with Scully and sidelined Jobs. On the 12th of September 1985, Steve Jobs was forced to resign from the company he'd founded.
What can I say? I hired the wrong guy.
That was Scully?
Yeah. And he destroyed everything I spent 10 years working for.
Sometimes you think you're doing the right thing by removing a force that appears to be a negative force, when in fact that's the life force. And what you really needed to do is feed that life force in a way that was going to work. And they weren't able to do that. I think they thought, thank God he's gone, now we can run a business. But you know, Apple isn't a business. I mean, it is a business, but it was the realization of a vision and a person behind that vision. Apple had it, and when they kicked Steve out, they lost it. And so lots of things started to fall apart. Lots and lots.
Steve Jobs wanted to change the world with Apple computers, and when he left the company, its very soul was ripped out. Over the next decade, this would lead to problem after problem. Apple had revolutionized the computer industry in the late 1970s.
This is my apple.
But nearly a decade of hit-and-miss products had left it commercially fragile. Steve Jobs' passion project, the Macintosh, had failed to turn Apple's fortunes around and cause divisions within the company. In 1985, Steve Jobs was ousted from the company he had co-founded.
Everyone who was working for Apple would have realized at the time that Steve Jobs leaving the company was detrimental.
To make things worse, that same year, Microsoft launched Windows, its own version of a graphical user interface that worked on IBM's personal computer or any computer with an Intel chip.
And Microsoft comes along and starts taking some of what Apple's doing and applying it to the PC, and that's the point at which the balance tips away from Apple.
With a wider range of hardware, software and prices, Intel computers running Windows software, the so-called Wintel sector, quickly overtook Apple's share of the market.
Beginning about 1988, the platform share of Apple was going progressively down, and it actually sunk below 10% around 1991, 1992. And an incredible top-down decision that was made at that time. It was It was decided, let's go up and crank up the entire supply chain And literally a calculation was done on how many computers needed to be bought and sold to get Apple's market share up to like 11, 12%. And Apple committed to all that inventory. Apple didn't sell it. Didn't come close. I think that's the first time the company realized it really was losing the Wintel war. And if you look back at the pricing, it's pretty clear why, because Apple products were selling at a premium to the Wintel products. Consumers are not stupid. And they would look at this and say, I really like Apple. I really want to buy Apple, but I just can't justify it personally.
Despite struggling with finances, Apple didn't stop innovating. One of its most ambitious projects came out in 1993, a handheld device called the Newton Message Pad.
People keep in touch. The idea behind Newton is that it's an assistant, something that actively helps you as you capture, organize, and communicate your ideas and information.
The Newton is a great example of everything that was good about Apple and bad about Apple in the early 1990s. The Newton was really, in some ways, a prototype iPhone, except that it could make phone calls. It was a handheld computer at a time where even laptops were still incredibly bulky things. It used artificial intelligence, had all of these amazing features. You could write on it with a stylus, and the idea was that it would then be able to kind of recognize what you were writing and turn that into computer text, which for 1993 is an incredibly ambitious project, but unfortunately it turned out to be too ambitious.
You know, Newton's pretty smart, but it's not always going to get your handwriting right. Like
The handwriting into text didn't work very well. People were disappointed with that. So you really had something that was really hard to use and expensive. And those two things made it a failure really right out of the launch. So it never took on at all, even amongst the hardcore Apple lovers. It just didn't work.
When you're done, Newton even has a smart way of getting rid of your trash.
Apple was panicking, but instead of consolidating, it continued to bring out different products.
They were bleeding money. They couldn't compete with cheaper competitors. They were making too many products. They were trying to do high-end, middle, lower-end, a diversity of models to cater to all the consumers. And so they lost their focus.
In 1993, the Apple board forced out CEO John Sculley, but two successive CEOs, Michael Spindler and Gil Amelio, couldn't stop the company from struggling as competitors launched fresh products that increasingly outperformed Apple's at lower prices.
It was a company which was losing an enormous amount of money. It was still bringing in revenue, but it just wasn't making profit, so it was losing a huge amount of money each year. That was really kind of the nadir for Apple. That was when everything went wrong. And it's unclear of how close it came to bankruptcy, but some people say it was within 90 days of having to close shop.
By the late 90s, Apple was on the brink of bankruptcy. It needed to do something drastic as quickly as possible. The return of co-founder Steve Jobs was seen by many as Apple's only hope, but the demanding pioneer was busy building a whole new empire.
This morning, at its offices in Silicon Valley, California, the company is about to get a first look at its new trademark.
After leaving Apple in 1985, Steve Jobs had started Next, a computer company aiming to create high-end hardware and software.
Well, I've forgotten how much work it actually is to start a company. It's a lot of work. And you've got to do everything. You've got to come up with a name. You've got to come up with a logo. In addition to designing the product, you've got to figure out what to design. You've got to figure out how you're going to get it to the marketplace. You've got to do a part number system. You've got to get bank accounts. You've got to set up charts, general ledgers, get a management information system, get a little kitchen set up, get a coffee maker, all this stuff.
You know, it isn't like this should be something new.
That's one.
But, I mean, I agree that, let me back up.
So somebody's got to say, here's what we can do, and we can make it happen, and here's the level of thing we can ship in 16 months. And what I hear him saying is, forget it. And boy, that just makes me smoke.
Jobs spent 12 years away from Apple, notably helping Next Computers develop an innovative operating system. However, there was no doubt where Jobs' heart and ambitions really lay.
The first week or so that I worked with him at Next, it was so clear that he was out for Apple revenge, and also that he was going to go back to Apple because he had something to prove. At this point, he'd been thrown out of the company that he gave birth to, like your child throwing you out, and he was going to go back and make that company a success.
Just how Steve Jobs would bring Apple back to life would revolutionize the computer industry and transform the way we live in the 21st century.
The Apple brand has clearly suffered from neglect, and we need to bring it back.
In 1996, Apple was on the verge of bankruptcy and desperately needed a new operating system for its Mac computers. So in December that year, CEO Gil Amelio bought Steve Jobs' next firm for its software, bringing Apple's founder back into the company.
Steve Jobs coming back to Apple, it was kind of a feel-good moment in the sense that, here's one of the founders come back to the company that he started. But I don't think that anyone could have predicted at that point that just that act of Steve Jobs returning was going to be what was going to restore Apple to profitability.
It took 7 months for Steve Jobs to convince the Apple board to fire CEO Gil Amelio.
Pleased to announce today that I'm going to drop the interim title.
At 42 years old, Jobs finally became the Chief Executive Officer of Apple.
Apple needed Steve Jobs as much as Steve Jobs needed Apple. It was his playground. And when he came in, for the first 30 months, he worked for $1 a year. He said, I'll come and I want to fix this.
The Apple brand has clearly suffered from neglect, and we need to bring it back.
He spent that whole time while he was at Next learning how to be a really good CEO. And that's what changed. He understood how to make a company operate and how to run it. And those who worked with him after he came back to Apple have a very different idea of Steve than those of us who worked with him before. So it was very clear that he changed. I don't think he ever got nicer, but he changed.
To save the company he loved, Steve Jobs needed to take immediate and often brutal decisions.
When Steve Jobs came back, he fired a lot of people, which is probably not necessarily a good thing for morale, but was a good thing for Apple's bottom line. He also got rid of a lot of the product lines which were not particularly profitable.
And so you're going to see the product line get much simpler, and you're going to see the product line get much better.
Here's to the crazy ones.
Apple's next challenge was to convince the rest of the world that Apple was worth buying from again.
Square holes. The ones who see things differently.
The Think Different advertising campaign was an attempt to relaunch the Apple brand, to bring it back to the counterculture-infused values that Steve Jobs first envisioned back in 1976, when the company was founded.
Is ignore them. Because they change things. They push the human race forward.
Think Different was another incredibly brilliant campaign that really started to attract not only the creatives, but people who wanted to be creative.
It honors those people who have changed it. Some of them are living, some of them are not. But the ones that aren't, as you'll see, you know that if they've ever used a computer, it would have been that.
I think the Think Different campaign was the inflection point that took it from a downhill slide to, okay, now we're going to go on up. That really is Steve's greatest gift, is that he is incredibly emotionally intelligent. He understands what people want before they do. He understands what they're going to do with things before they do. And that's what he capitalized on when he came back with the Think Different campaign. So now he realizes, okay, we have a cult here. Let's protect that cult. Let's feed that cult and see if we can get it to grow.
This group of die-hard London Mac users meet monthly to share news and information on Apple. Like most fans of the company, they reject the idea that they're like members of a cult.
I wouldn't see it as a cult. I have a very different opinion of a cult.
So this software update here is for the operating system. And the Mac App Store is now where you're getting the update for the apps.
So, do you love me?
You're looking for love in all the wrong places.
Siri, is Apple a religion?
Apple's website's going to be able to answer your question.
For me, Apple feels like a an old friend. It does feel like a company that I've been able to trust all my life. They've always pushed things. They've always pushed the future.
C cable was at primary school. I can remember the exact Mac I used as well. It was in year 3 of school. I remember just being able to draw on a computer screen was something completely different.
The keyboard was brilliant. It was translucent. The mouse, if you moved it around, you had a multicolored ball, so you could tell if it was moving or not. They had spent so much effort to make you smile, compared to a beige box, which is boring.
Apple's next product certainly put a smile on the faces of the fans and the company's accountants. In 1998, the iMac G3 arrived.
A lot of people will remember the iMac G3 as the kind of blobby, colourful Macintosh from the late 1990s. It's kind of translucent blue, coloured after the sea on some Australian beach. Really, I would say that the iMac is the machine which comes at the same time that Apple suddenly becomes profitable again. So really, that is one of the most significant products in Apple history.
It was a machine that everyone could afford. And it was beautiful. But it was more than that. It was very, very easy to kind of pick up. It was very, very easy to feel connected to it. And for it to feel like an extension of you.
Designed by Jonathan Ive, the iMac G3 was a transformative success for Apple. In its first 5 months, it sold close to 800,000 iMac G3 units.
It's the product which introduces the world to not only the return of Steve Jobs, but also Johnny Ive, who becomes an enormously significant figure in Apple's history as the designer of so many of its later products. And this was the first time that they had worked together.
From losing around $1 billion in 1997, the company posted a $309 million profit just 1 year later. And this was just the beginning. Steve Jobs and Apple's next target was the music industry.
The record publishers were forcing young people to buy an entire album that they would listen to only for a few months on their MP3 player. And the music publishing industry was almost ready to be destroyed. Apple wanted to do something, not just a MP3 player. It actually took on the challenge of saving the music publishing industry.
The launch of the iTunes music service in 2001 allowed users to rip, burn and listen to individual music tracks legally and easily. It almost single-handedly pulled the rug from music pirates and paved the way for Apple's next hardware release. In October 2001, the iPod portable music player was released.
I think the iMac was probably the product that relaunched Apple, but the innovations came quite fast, one after the other. So the iPod was truly revolutionary. iTunes was a brilliant idea. iTunes and iPod function together. You can't have one without the other. Again, you suddenly had this closed proprietary system, but everyone wanted in.
Apple had always been a company that was willing to experiment, but it hadn't ever managed to do these completely successfully. With the iPod, then suddenly it manages to take a very promising product, the MP3 player, and using some beautiful design, invented as this product that everyone wants.
Many attempts have been made to produce a successful portable MP3 player, notably from Asian companies like Seihan, Kowon and Creative. But Apple's iPod, with its innovative design, backed by compelling marketing, came to dominate the market, becoming, by 2007, the fastest-selling digital music player of all time.
It changed the entire music industry.
Steve Jobs' next trick was to set the bar for all mobile technology.
Today, we're introducing 3 revolutionary products of this class. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone,
getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone.
So after a few years, the iPod, people start saying, well, as soon as someone invents a phone which is able to play music, that's going to decimate the iPod market. So Apple thinks that's fine, but we'll invent the phone. And that's when you get the iPhone.
The iPhone spawned a whole breed of smartphone rivals. Manufacturers from Samsung to Sony entered the market, sparking a new war for the supremacy of the mobile phone industry. In July 2008, Apple launched the App Store with 500 apps for the iPhone. In its first weekend, 10 million apps were downloaded. Like the success of iTunes before it, this was a key moment in the commodification of digital content and paved the way for future Apple products.
There are many companies that do one thing great, and that's all they ever do. So I think what the iPod iTunes, followed by the iPhone, made everybody realize Apple wasn't just a one-hit wonder. It had something in its DNA, that it had the ability to make a continued series of great products. By the time the iPad came out, everybody expected the iPad to come out and be a great product.
With its proliferation of products, Apple's fan base was growing, and in 2001, Steve Jobs gave his congregation a church, the Apple Store. Tim Kobe is the designer of the Apple stores.
People would see Apple advertising, they would see their products, and it would drive traffic to the resellers. But the resellers were also selling, 20 other computers. And so they were typically being countersold away from the product they came in for to one where the retailer had a better margin or was able to convince them it was a more appropriate product. Okay, so this is our R&D area.
Steve Jobs took a typically hands-on role in the design of the stores.
The idea of Steve, criticizing the screw heads on these metal panels and the mock-ups and things that we went through were it was an extraordinary time. Steve really understood what the Apple brand was about. All the qualities that we were putting into the retail store ultimately went through him as a filter that this was Apple brand qualities that were going into the space. He used design as a competitive tool. He used it as a way of creating compelling experience for people. And I think he probably used design in a much more sophisticated way than most companies do.
The store is divided into 4 parts.
The plans for the Apple stores received a lot of criticism from the industry. It was thought to be a huge risk to open a specific retail store just to sell Apple products.
So this first 25% of the store, you see the whole product line.
People were saying it was going to be a big mistake, that they were risking millions of dollars on opening an Apple store. But ultimately, the real risk was probably listening to those pundits, listening to those people who were saying it was risky.
Within 3 years of the first Apple store opening in 2001, Apple became the fastest retailer in history to reach $1 billion in sales. And there are now over 500 stores across the globe.
They've really grown their network of Apple stores in China enormously over the last few years. They opened a store in Singapore last year, and they're pushing to open Apple stores in India as well. So they've certainly made nods to embracing that market.
I think opening the Apple stores was a brilliant idea because it created that sense of I'm going into somewhere special to buy a special product. It's about creating that complete, total customer experience.
Steve Jobs' world-changing vision for his company was getting fulfilled. But in 2003, Jobs was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and in 2011, he passed away. Apple was now a huge success, but with its visionary leader gone, how would the company cope in new markets and facing aggressive new rivals? In 2011, Apple became the world's most valuable publicly traded company.
I love it.
On August the 24th of the same year, Steve Jobs resigned from the company he had founded, and 6 weeks later died of cancer. He was 56 years old.
So thank you very much to our extended families out there.
I was devastated. I felt that I'd lost a close friend. Never met the man, never seen him in person, only ever kind of watched him from afar. But it was a real sense of loss. A real sense of loss.
He made design cool. He inspired people to like computing. The quote from Blade Runner that the light that burns twice as bright lasts half as long. And that was Steve Jobs.
When Steve Jobs died, there's absolutely no doubt that it affected Apple in the sense that suddenly the company was robbed of its visionary leader. People thought that Apple would suddenly crumble without this visionary figurehead behind it.
Apple had struggled once before without Steve Jobs, but this time Jobs had groomed someone to replace him, Tim Cook.
Tim Cook is not the same kind of leader that Steve Jobs was. He's not necessarily a visionary leader, but he's a great, great business strategist. And to give some sense of how successful Apple has been since Steve Jobs died, when Steve Jobs died, Apple's market cap was about 347 billion. Today it's over 900 billion, and it's on its way this year to potentially becoming the world's first $1 trillion company in history.
I love Apple, and I consider it the privilege of a lifetime to have worked here for almost 14 years, and I am very excited about this new role.
Under Tim Cook, Apple has grown globally, significantly exploiting the rising power of the Asian consumer.
其他的品牌好像没有使用过，智能手机使用第一步就属于我吧。
iPhone， 所有的 iPhone， 各种型号，我每年换一个。
Apple is one of those real amazing success stories for China. 2010, 2011, they arrived and they all started buying smartphones. Prior to that, they were not really a major force in the world, Chinese consumers. And Apple comes in at the right time, smartphones growing very rapidly.
One of the things that we've seen in the last few years has been an enormous sort of growing impact and importance to markets like, for example, China and India, sort of developing markets. And these are ones which Apple has been very, very quick to embrace. Tim Cook's actually talked about the fact that Apple's products today are designed for a Chinese audience in some senses. If you look at the gold iPhone, which Apple introduced a few years ago, that very much is a phone which has been very successful in China and quite possibly was aimed at the Chinese market to begin with.
2015 is kind of the high mark, where Apple's got like 25% of the China market. It's responsible for half of their global growth is China. And in the process of this, they establish a well-known, incredibly well-respected brand. A luxury brand is really what they are.
手机，然后那个 iTouch， 最早以前 iTouch， 然后现在那个笔记本电脑，但是就是常用的都是苹果的。
我的粘性完全使用习惯完全是在 iOS 上，在 iCloud 上。
In China now, the App Store brings in more revenue than the App Store in the US. So there is a sort of a shift between the two markets, and I think that that's something that Tim Cook has been very, very aware that he needs to kind of embrace, that these are no longer markets which can just be sort of taken as, you know, as a nice added extra. This is where the battles of the future are really going to be fought, and Tim Cook has really embraced that.
One of the major battles facing Apple in China is the threat of highly innovative rivals, all trying to take a bite out of Apple's market.
Apple has succeeded in China as much as any foreign company can hope to succeed. But then what always happens here is phase two, which is local competitors come on. and they come on very strong. And that's what's been happening in the last, since about 2015 till now. It's just one very smart, well-run local competitor after another. Vivo, Oppo, Xiaomi, Huawei. And now Apple is just fighting. But that is life here.
I think some of the difficulties in Asia has been price. So a lot of lower priced products, phones you can get, competition from local brands like Xiaomi, like Samsung and so on. Samsung does incredibly well in Asia. So very strong mobile phone competitors, very strong computer competitors like Lenovo. So in each one of the categories in which Apple is very good, it has faced very strong local competition. And I think that's been difficult. It's also priced at a price point which is higher than most Asian competitors are willing to pay for.
Being at the top of the tree makes Apple not only a big target for any rivals, but also for any criticism. Battery life issues, sticky keyboards, environmental policies, and labour violations all threaten to tarnish Apple's reputation and challenge the loyalty of even its most devoted fans.
Most people are feeling bullied by Apple. You know, they upgraded the system on their iPhone 6, then iPhone immediately became almost unusably slow. Now, who's that helping? Who is that helping? It's not helping the customer.
There are 1.3 billion active Apple devices being used around the world. But to stay at the top of the tree, Apple needs to keep giving customers what they want, and that's innovation.
I really hope they will continue pushing the boundaries in terms of innovation in all those industries they're playing in. I'm afraid that they're losing their, the mojo, that they're losing that edge.
It hasn't been the leader it once was in terms of innovation, and it's probably difficult for any company to sustain that over a long period of time. But where I think they should be looking to be successful is getting back to focusing on what matters to people. Solve the 1,000 songs in your pocket problem, not how thick is my iPhone problem. What matters is what does this technology do to make my life easier, to make my life better.
Tim Cook is an incredible CEO and an incredible steward of the assets he was left, and has taken those and grown them and made an amazingly high value company. But he's not a visionary, and that's an issue, I think, for Apple.
Apple has evolved hugely over the past 42 years. From being a company rooted in counterculture rebellion, it is now a massive capitalist machine. Whether the next chapter for the company will see Apple growing further or being laid low by rivals is yet to be seen.
What we know here historically is companies rise and fall. You never stay at the top for very long until somebody comes in, and it's always better to be second or third or be the underdog of an industry because you have somewhere to look up to and you have a competitor you want to beat.
What Apple has managed to do is diversify in a way that they hadn't previously. Today, the Apple stock price is less reflective of one product than at any point in the company's history. So even though the iPhone is still by a wide margin Apple's biggest seller, Apple's services industry, for example, is enormous. It now represents around 30% of Apple's revenue. That's things like Apple Music, which now has about 50 million worldwide subscribers, iCloud, other services like this. So in some ways, Apple has continued to put out some hit products, but not necessarily in the way that they did under Steve Jobs. I actually think that despite the fact that at some point logic dictates that Apple will fall, I think Apple is looking more secure and stable than at any point in its history.
If you look at Apple, their real competitors today are not computer companies and so on. They're Google, Amazon, those kinds of companies, incredibly creative, innovative companies as well. But it depends what Apple has in the pipeline. I don't have a crystal ball.
I think I read about this happen, so they should.
It was the summer of 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, and the stage was being set for the next big player in the video game arena. Literally. As event employees prepared at the Los Angeles Convention Center, Sony executives finalized their statements for the upcoming show. For the past few years, Sony had been working closely with Nintendo, the market leader in video games, to develop a new console. Sony, an ever-expanding company, was looking to dip their toes into the growing video game market. Behind the doors of these two companies, a joint venture was made that incorporated Sony's CD technology with Nintendo's video game know-how to create the ultimate gaming system of its era, the PlayStation. On June 2nd, Sony announced their partnership to the world. It was a huge step for the company into the wild, wild west of gaming. But with Nintendo by their side, it seemed like an easy investment for the electronics giant. The following day, Sony executives found their seats within the audience at CES as Nintendo came on stage for their own presentation. Unlike Sony's announcement the day before, however, Nintendo didn't tell the world they were working with Sony. Instead, they announced a partnership with Sony's rival Philips, sending shockwaves across the gaming world. For any other company, the public embarrassment handed down by Nintendo would be enough to dissuade them from ever entering the gaming market. But for Sony and the PlayStation, this was only the beginning. Everything has a story. This is the story of the PlayStation. In this series, we'll be taking a deep dive into the creation of the PlayStation console, starting with Sony's origins, following them through to the end of the original PlayStation's lifespan in the early 21st century. We'll be detailing the various people who helped create the PlayStation, and those who helped make it a household name. We'll also be looking at the various games, interesting innovations, and legacy of Sony's first home console. When you think of Sony as a brand, you probably imagine crisp televisions, high-end cameras, and of course, video games. But the company's origins come from much humbler beginnings. In 1947, Masura Ibuka founded Tokyo Tsushin Kogyo, or TTK. The small electronics company was built during the post-war recovery period of Japan, when the United States military still maintained rule over the Japanese islands. Ibuka grew the company during these rebuilding years, and in 1955, TTK released their first transistor radio for commercial purchases. The radio became a huge hit and helped establish TTK as a global brand. By 1958, TTK changed their name from Tokyo Tsushin Kogyo to Sony to help appeal to a wider global market. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Sony continued to innovate in the field of electronics with radios, televisions, and more, all bearing the Sony name. In 1979, Sony released one of their most recognizable pieces of technology, the Walkman. The sleek tape player became a must-have for music enthusiasts, and made Sony one of the most recognizable brands in electronics for the coming decade. 2 years after the Walkman, the world's first CD player, the Sony CDP-101, made its way to the market. The CD, created in partnership between Sony and their European rival Philips, revolutionized the entertainment and electronics world and made Sony one of the wealthiest companies in all of Japan. By the end of the 1980s, Sony was reinvesting their profits with new acquisitions and entertainment. Sony purchased CBS Records in 1987 for $2 million, giving the company its own record label. 2 years later, in 1989, Sony purchased 49% of Columbia Pictures, after it was spun off as an independent company just a few years earlier. Sony purchased the remaining shares of the studio a few months later, making the company the majority stakeholders of the film studio. These weren't just fleeting purchases to borrow money. Sony was truly investing in the entertainment market. It made it apparent in 1991. That year, CBS Records and Columbia Pictures would be renamed to Sony Music Entertainment Incorporated and Sony Pictures Incorporated, respectively. Sony's work in video games came during this time, and it was largely by accident. It was Ken Kutaragi, an engineer at Sony, that made the first move within the company. Kutaragi and his team developed a sound chip known as the SPC 700 for Nintendo's upcoming Super Famicom system, helping give the system its superior sound qualities over rival game consoles. It wasn't unusual for Sony to develop different parts for other manufacturers' electronics. What was unusual was Kutaragi's efforts to keep the project a secret from his bosses at Sony. For the past few years, Kutaragi had watched his daughter play video games on Nintendo's popular Famicom and saw great potential in the medium. Kutaragi
yung ano eh. Yung boy Apple guy.
Ano Apple?
Ay, ito Apple.
Ano yun?
1993 pala talaga. Gusto ni Steve Jobs talaga. Yung Apple, ano ka yung easy to use talaga. 1993 pa yan. 1993 meron pa stylus pen ah.
Ay, we?
Ayun. Kaya lang mahal.
Magkano tayo? Nung dati, apa naman?
1993. Kasi nga yung si Steve Jobs kasi, parang gusto niya na yung Apple, part ng buhay mo. Galing po tayo na rin, tinulad ko ngayon. Okay, kasi i-report ko sa ano eh, sa Wednesday. Kaya yun ako, ito pala, taputangin ng itong Apple na.
Ano siya, kumbaga, pero magkano tatay, yung naging stylus pen nung parang, nung nirelease niya pa lang?
Wala, di ba, mahal talaga siya, kaya lang gusto mo ng
nauna lang sa Amerika.
Gusto ng pina-pounder. Kailangan yung Apple, part na, alam mo yung very easy to use ko siya. Yung nangyayari, ito yung competition niya. Napakalaki ng computer. Kaya napakaliit lang pa rin. Parang, kaya ng appliance na sa bahay. Galing ko na. Ito ka lang, pagkutangin na ito. Kaya pa, ang daling gawin ng Apple.
Bali, siya dun sa research topic mo.
Oo, syempre, ano yun eh. Ang maganda kasi, hindi ko kaya magbasa ng libro. At kasi ito YouTube, putang yan. Hindi kaya ko nang laro yung support ko pa. Diba?
Sabi mo Rino? Rino.
However, was unsuccessful in convincing his superiors at Sony of the potential video games offered. News of Kutaragi's work with Nintendo without permission was more than enough for many executives to justify terminating him. Thankfully, Kutaragi and the Super Nintendo sound chip would be spared. Norio Oga, then president of Sony, saw potential in both Kutaragi and his work in the video game market. Oga kept the project afloat and allowed Kutaragi and his team to finish the sound chip in time for the launch of the Super Famicom, putting a piece of Sony tech in every single new Nintendo home console. Before the launch of the Super Famicom, however, Nintendo and Sony were already looking to the future of video games. In 1988, the two companies started another partnership, but it would be more than just a single sound chip. Rather, Sony and Nintendo were teaming up to create a brand new game console. The details of this partnership would eventually spell doom for the deal. Nintendo's upcoming Super Famicom system would release with a single cartridge slot on the top of the system, but work on a CD-based add-on using Sony's Super Disc format continued behind the scenes after launch. Additionally, a hybrid version of the system that could play Super Famicom and Super Disc games was in development and was given the code name PlayStation. This hybrid console was the same one shown off by Sony at CES 1991. The contract, however, became more and more unfavorable for Nintendo as development progressed. Under the original contract, Sony retained all licensing rights of the Super Disc format and had complete control over the manufacturing of discs. The new system would bear Nintendo's name, but Sony reaped most of the rewards and controlled more of the process than Nintendo liked. Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi, already unhappy with Sony over disagreements regarding Super Famicom sound chips, decided enough was enough. Yamauchi dispatched Minoru Arakawa and Howard Lincoln of Nintendo of America to begin negotiations with Sony's chief rival Philips in hopes of securing a better deal for for a CD-based console. At CES 1991, these backroom deals came to the limelight during Nintendo's press event. To many within Sony, Nintendo's betrayal had gone too far. Not only had they gone behind Sony's back to work with Philips, but Nintendo had publicly humiliated Sony amongst the Japanese business community. Talks with Nintendo, however, were ongoing. Many people at both companies held out hope that they could salvage the relationship. Work on the system continued, and many games were in development for the upcoming CD add-on. Most of these would later be canceled, or shifted development to other systems. Sony even continued to create prototypes of the hybrid Nintendo PlayStation, with these prototypes becoming high-value collector's items in the years since. Sony also reached out to other companies during this time to try and strike a new deal regarding a game system. The most notable of these was Sega, who was already at battle against Nintendo with their Sega Genesis console. Sony's proposals never made it past Sega's board of directors, who shut down the offer, opting to keep their hardware development within Sega's own R&D teams. For Sony, three options were debated within the company. They could work with Nintendo, or another console manufacturer again, although for many this was unacceptable. Another option was just giving up on video games entirely. Many of the more senior and conservative executives within Sony didn't want anything to do with video games, seeing them as children's playthings and uncivilized. Nintendo's public embrace of Philips and Sega's aggressive marketing really proved this point to many. The final option was the riskiest. Rather than work with an already established company, Sony would go it alone and make the PlayStation its own system, as opposed to a CD add-on. By May of 1992, nearly a year after Sony unveiled their prototype PlayStation, the decision within the company had been made. Sony ended all negotiations with various game partners. Like so many other companies in the mid-90s, Sony wanted their own piece of the gaming market. Sony now had its sights set firmly on releasing a game console all on their own. Just a month after Sony cut off negotiations with Nintendo, Ken Kutaragi and his team were waiting to present their vision for Sony's first game console. Unlike past versions of the PlayStation that featured a cartridge slot for Super Famicom games, this new model would be completely CD-based and utilize Sony's own CD-based technology. Kutaragi, in the hopes of differentiating his new version of the console from previous models, dubbed the system the PSX, or PlayStation X. Sony was going full steam ahead with video games, but opposition still remained within the company. To alleviate the pressure of office politics, Kutaragi and a small team were transferred to Sony Music, a subsidiary within Sony. Thanks to Sony Music's experience developing and manufacturing CDs, Kutaragi and his team felt right at home developing the PlayStation. Sony's R&D teams had plenty to work with when crafting the PlayStation, but unlike other console manufacturers like Sega and Nintendo, Sony didn't have any teams dedicated to video game software development. Instead of starting completely from scratch, Sony invested into the games industry to secure new titles for their upcoming console. In 1992, Sony purchased Lemmings creator Psygnosis for $48 million. Sony further invested into the UK-based studio, helping the developer grow to over 500 employees within a few years. Sony also reached out to various third-party developers to design and port games to the PlayStation starting in mid-1993. Over 250 developers pledged to support the system before it was even released. Notably, major arcade cabinet producers like Namco came on board for the PlayStation. At the time, Namco and Sega were locked into their own rivalry in the arcade scene. Namco's support of the PlayStation served as an early blow to Sega's upcoming Saturn system. As 1993 came to a close, Sony wanted to make it clear to all the other major companies of the gaming world that they meant business. On October 27, 1993, Sony officially announced the PlayStation X. The X would ultimately be dropped from the final name of the system, although some marketing materials still use the title. The PlayStation was planned to launch next year, and Sony was eager to showcase their dedication to gaming. Less than a month after announcing their new system, Sony created a new subsidiary called Sony Computer Entertainment, or SCE. This new subsidiary was formed from various parts of Sony and Sony Music to consolidate all of their work in video games under a single division. Sony executive Olaf Olofsson, a longtime champion of gaming within the company, became the first president and CEO of SCE. Part of Sony's original sales pitch to push game developers into developing for the PlayStation was the ease and freedom that developing for the system would offer. The downside is that the PlayStation used a very expensive development kit based on Sony's line of News computer workstations. This came to an end at CES 1994. Developers from Psygnosis asked SN Systems, a UK-based development studio, to design a simple and more cost-effective workstation. SN Systems developed a PC-based development kit for the PlayStation and won over Sony executives during a presentation at the event. Sony abandoned their own internal development kits in favor of SN Systems and ordered over 600 development kits at CES alone. SN Systems and Sony continued to work together on future consoles like the PlayStation 2. Partnership proved so successful that Sony purchased SN Systems in 2005, and they continued to develop software for the PlayStation line of consoles. Lines wrap around Japanese stores on the chilly morning of December 3rd, 1994. After years of delays, broken business promises, and internal company strife, gamers across Japan were finally able to get their hands on the new PlayStation console. The new system was priced at 39,800 yen in the region and launched alongside 8 different games. The most notable of these releases was a near-perfect port of Namco's arcade hit Ridge Racer. The hype surrounding Sony's entry into the console market was quickly proven right, as over 100,000 PlayStations were sold on day one of release. By the end of the month, Japanese retailers had sold over 300,000 consoles. The PlayStation's launch in Japan was successful, but it didn't make Sony the market leader overnight. In fact, the PlayStation's successful launch fell in the shadow of Sega's own new console, the Sega Saturn. The Saturn launched just a few weeks before the PlayStation in the region on November 22nd. A near-perfect arcade port of Sega's Virtua Fighter made the system a must-have. During the 6 weeks following the Saturn's launch, Sega stated that they sold over 500,000 Sega Saturns in the region, giving them an early lead in the 5th generation of consoles. Still, Sony was doing well in their home country, despite being the new kid on the block. As 1994 came to a close, Sony shifted their gaze across the Pacific to the golden goose of the gaming market, North America. But they weren't alone. Sega had already announced plans to release the Saturn in North America sometime in 1995, and Nintendo was teasing a new system, one more powerful than Sony's 32-bit PlayStation. If Sony wanted to stand any chance against Sega's Saturn or any of the other major systems about to be released, they would have to give it their all. The first E3 was a history-defining event. For years, video games were showcased at the Consumer Electronics Show. It's at CES where Nintendo and Sega duked it out in the early 1990s, and where plenty of other major players came to announce the latest in video games. By 1995, however, video games had grown to encompass more and more of CES every year, and it was time for gaming to get its own convention. From May 11th to May 13th, 1995, more than 50,000 people descended upon the Los Angeles Convention Center for the first Electronic Entertainment Expo. The event featured 15 different publishers, showcasing new titles for the 1995 and 1996 calendar year. But the most notable were the big 3 console manufacturers at the time: Sega, Nintendo, and Sony. Nintendo's showcase was surprisingly limited at the event. While Sony and Sega already had their new systems out in Japan, Nintendo was still working on their next console, then dubbed the Nintendo Ultra 64. In its place was the underwhelming Virtual Boy, that launched only a few months after the event. But Sony was focused on making a big splash with the PlayStation, and brought out many of its top American executives to the event. Sony started their press conference with a look at the various products the company had created over the years, including the Walkman and the CD. The trailer lasted only a few minutes, and ended with a look at the PlayStation. It was Sony's way of telling the gaming world that they were ready to innovate in gaming as much as they had in other business sectors. Most of the event for Sony was presented by Olof Olsson, President and CEO of Sony Computer Entertainment. Olofsson's presentation would be unrecognizable by modern standards, as the Icelandic businessman detailed Sony's business strategy for creating and marketing the PlayStation system. The presentation lasted less than 30 minutes, with most of the time discussing the monetary value for Sony getting into the video game market. Olofsson also made sure to point out Sony's other entertainment assets, and boldly stated that while Sony wasn't abandoning their roots of consumer electronics, the company as a whole was now focused on providing one thing: entertainment. As the presentation came to a close, Olofsson rattled off more details about the PlayStation, notably its superior hardware when compared to the 16-bit Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. For the finale of Sony's presentation, Olafsson welcomed Steve Race to the stage. Race was a veteran of the games industry, having worked for Atari and Sega before joining Sony as president of the PlayStation Group in 1993. Race had 4 remarks prepared in advance of the presentation, but these would be discarded as he made his way up to the stage. Race walked up to the microphone and uttered the famous words that cemented the PlayStation as a market leader for a generation.
$2.99.
Much melody, much crispier, much juicier, much masarap. Sumibo sa ugat na lang.
Yung pinagdadaanan mo sa trabaho, sa pamilya, sa love life mo, parang kaya ba?
In the weeks before E3, Sega had announced that the North American version of the Sega Saturn would be retailed for $399, with a planned launch for September 1995. Not only had Sony beat them on pricing, but the PlayStation was set to launch in North America just 1 week later. Sony was no longer interested in playing with its video game competitors. They were ready to redefine the industry. The best news for the PlayStation, however, came the day after Sony's press conference. Sega went into E3 1995 with a bit of a chip on their shoulder. At the time, Sega of America was under the direction of Tom Klaczynski. Klaczynski joined Sega in 1990 and helped steer the fledgling Genesis into the most popular video game console in North America. Klaczynski was still beholden to Sega's board of directors in Japan, and in the run-up to E3, they had come to a bizarre decision. During Sega's E3 press conference, Klaczynski announced that the Sega Saturn, set to launch in only 4 months, was available at select retailers that very day. It was an unprecedented move by Sega. The early launch was meant to give Sega a leg up on Sony, much like they had done with Nintendo only a few years earlier. A 4-month head start might have helped Sega if they hadn't been so secretive with their plans. The Sega Saturn launched that day for $399 alongside 6 titles. Unfortunately, stock was short, and retailers left out of Sega's scheme were upset that they never received the latest Sega console. For many, this was the beginning of Sega's long fall from grace as one of gaming's biggest players. The rest of E3 was a hit for Sony. Their booths on the show floor attracted plenty of eager gamers who were ready to check out the latest in gaming. In one final twist of the knife, Sony invited pop superstar Michael Jackson to their booth, where the king of pop was seen checking out the PlayStation. It was another blow to Sega, who beforehand had worked with Michael Jackson on a Moonwalker game for the Genesis and on the music for Sonic the Hedgehog 3. The next 4 months flew by. The Saturn floundered in the summer sun during this time, as stock shortages and a lack of software continued to plague the system, with most third-party publishers sticking to their original release schedule for the Saturn. A 4-month head start would have been great, but only if you could actually keep up. Sony backed the PlayStation with a massive $40 million ad campaign in the lead-up to its September launch. Thanks to the growing popularity of video games, TV commercials have become more and more common, and Sony was fully embracing them. A series of commercials with the tagline, "You are not red, E," and "Enos," or "Ready 9th of September," littered commercial breaks in advance of the system's release. These early commercials were primarily targeted at teenagers, and Sony hoped to steal one of Sega's key demographics. For North America, the long wait for the PlayStation finally came to an end on September 9, 1995. The PlayStation launched for $299 and came with a PlayStation console, a single controller, and all of the necessary hookups for the system. Like many other CD-based consoles of the day, the PlayStation could also be used as a CD player, a feature Sony boasted about when showcasing the PlayStation as a multimedia platform, as opposed to just a game console. Unlike other console manufacturers of the day, however, Sony opted not to include a game with the PlayStation, in part to keep costs down. A total of 10 titles were released for the PlayStation on day 1. Namco's Ridge Racer was just as popular in North America as it was in Japan. New releases like Ubisoft's 2D platformer Rayman and a port of Midway's Mortal Kombat 3 added variety to the lineup. In North America, PlayStation games were released in tall, plastic cases, almost exactly like the ones that Sega used for the Sega CD and Sega Saturn in North America. This was in contrast to these smaller jewel cases used by both Sony and Sega in Japan. These oversized boxes wouldn't last for long, and in less than a year would be phased out entirely in favor of jewel cases. The PlayStation also launched with a handful of accessories, including standalone controllers, memory cards for saving data, and a system link cable for multiplayer titles. Sony's North American launch was a major success, with the PlayStation outselling the Saturn within 2 days in the region. Less than 3 weeks after launch in North America, the PlayStation was released in European markets on September 29, 1995. The European launch didn't feature as many titles as the North American launch, but the PlayStation's killer app, Ridge Racer, was available alongside Wipeout, a futuristic racing game developed by Sony-owned Psygnosis. For many Europeans, Wipeout would define the launch of the PlayStation, much like Ridge Racer had in the other regions. The launch across Europe was a major success, especially in the United Kingdom, where Psygnosis was located. In the UK alone, Sony dedicated a total of £20 million to marketing the PlayStation. The marketing campaign paid off in spades, as the PlayStation outsold the Sega Saturn 3-1 in the country during the holiday 1995 shopping season. The last 3 months of 1995 were dominated by new releases on the PlayStation. Thanks to Sony's diligence, plenty of developers were lining up to release their games on the system. Alongside Ridge Racer, Namco published Air Combat, the first game in the popular Ace Combat series. Namco followed up their racing and aerial combat games with a port of their 1994 fighting game, Tekken, in November. The 3D fighter was an immediate success on the system, with many drawing comparisons to Sega's own Virtua Fighter series. Sony Computer Entertainment was also publishing some early hits on the console. Twisted Metal and Jumping Flash both made their North American debut in November, with other regions receiving the game at different times. Twisted Metal became a smash hit for Sony and the PlayStation, with multiple sequels appearing on the system and its successor, the PlayStation 2. Jumping Flash, a first-person platformer co-developed by Ultra and Exact, was one of the earliest 3D platformers and came out over a year before the industry-changing Super Mario 64. Other notable games to come out during these months were Warhawk, a military shooter published by Sony, and a port of Micropose's XCOM UFO Defense. The final region to receive the PlayStation did so on November 15, 1995, when it was released in Australia. With the laying down under finally getting their hands on Sony's great console, the rollout of the PlayStation was complete. In less than a year, the PlayStation made its way onto store shelves in almost every major region in the world. But the year ahead wouldn't be a cakewalk, as Sony's former business partner Nintendo prepared the world for their next system. Going into 1996, gaming was transitioning from 2D to 3D games, and the biggest name in gaming, Nintendo, was about to throw their hat in the ring. The PlayStation, however, was only getting more and more popular. In March of 1996, the first killer app for the PlayStation hit store shelves, Resident Evil. Developed by Capcom and directed by Shinji Mikami, Resident Evil offered a drastically different form of gameplay compared to its contemporaries. Rather than focusing on killing enemies or achieving high scores, Resident Evil focused on survival. Combined with horror elements like zombies, mutants, and a spooky mansion, Resident Evil helped pioneer the survival horror genre of the mid-1990s. Published by Sony, and a port of Micropose's XCOM UFO Defense. The final region to receive the PlayStation did so on November 15, 1995, when it was released in Australia. With the laying down under finally getting their hands on Sony's great console, the rollout of the PlayStation was complete. In less than a year, the PlayStation made its way onto store shelves in almost every major region in the world. But the year ahead wouldn't be a cakewalk, as Sony's former business partner Nintendo prepared the world for their next system. Going into 1996, gaming was transitioning from 2D to 3D games, and the biggest name in gaming, Nintendo, was about to throw their hat in the ring. The PlayStation, however, was only getting more and more popular. In March of 1996, the first killer app for the PlayStation hit store shelves, Resident Evil. Developed by Capcom and directed by Shinji Mikami, Resident Evil offered a drastically different form of gameplay compared to its contemporaries. Rather than focusing on killing enemies or achieving high scores, Resident Evil focused on survival. Combined with horror elements like zombies, mutants, and a spooky mansion, Resident Evil helped pioneer the survival horror genre of the mid-1990s, alongside titles like Alone in the Dark and later PlayStation releases like Silent Hill. Resident Evil quickly became the best-selling game on the PlayStation. Alongside various re-releases on the system, Resident Evil sold more than 5 million copies worldwide and established the new horror series as a juggernaut in gaming. E3 1996 followed in May of that year. Sony's focus was on their software lineup, with the company showcasing multiple new titles aimed for release on the PlayStation by the end of the year. The most notable announcement for the PlayStation during the show regarding the ongoing price wars with Sega. On the first day of E3 1996, Sega announced that the Saturn would see a price cut and received a new MSRP of $199. Sega had already cut the price of the Saturn down to $300 in October of 1995, but in their desperate attempt to salvage the system, Sega was taking an even bigger loss on their hardware. Sony responded by lowering the price of the PlayStation to $199 as well, although Sony lost less on each PlayStation than Sega did for each Saturn they manufactured, due to lower manufacturing costs. Like Sega and Sony, Nintendo announced that the Nintendo 64, once suggested to sell for $250, would launch at the same price as its competitors, $199 US. The second half of 1996 was highlighted by multiple notable games. Psygnosis became one of PlayStation's premier developers during this time, with 7 different games hitting the PlayStation in 1996. Among these releases was a 3D version of Psygnosis' popular Lemmings game called Lemmings 3D, and a sequel to Wipeout called Wipeout 2097. Sequels to popular games like Tekken and Twisted Metal quickly made their way onto the PlayStation. Tekken 2 was released in August and was more popular than the original release, selling over 5 million copies on the system. Twisted Metal 2 was directed by David Jaffe, who would later go on to create the God of War series, and became the best-selling game in the series with over 1.5 million copies sold. In November, North America received the first in Atlus's Persona series, Revelations Persona. Not all games released for the PlayStation during this time were good, however. One of the most infamous PlayStation releases of late 1996 was the critically panned Bugsy 3D, published by Accolade. The game was cited by many as one of the worst video games ever released. In November of 1996, the PlayStation received a new game called Tomb Raider, and its popularity would quickly eclipse the other titles on Sony's platform. Developed by Core Design and published by Eidos Interactive, Tomb Raider didn't make a huge impression on the gaming community until demos of the game were showcased at E3 1996. The game's stunning graphics and fun gameplay were enough to get people interested, but it was Tomb Raider's leading lady that caught most players' eyes. At the time, female protagonists in video games were few and far between. Outside of helmeted heroes like Metroid Samus Aran, or the pink bow sporting palette swap called Miss Pac-Man, the biggest female characters in gaming were your typical damsels in distress. With Tomb Raider, players weren't just playing as an androgynous suit of armor or 7/8 of a yellow circle. They were playing as Lara Croft, a fully developed female character, whose own presentation sported a feminine and adventurous look. In the coming years, Lara Croft would become one of gaming's biggest names, and helped push the first Tomb Raider title to be the 9th best-selling game on the PlayStation, with over 7 million copies sold worldwide. One game, however, would come to define the PlayStation in 1996. It was one of Sony's own titles, developed by a little-known game studio in Santa Monica, California. Founded as Jam Software in 1984, Naughty Dog spent the past decade primarily developing games for personal computers. After changing their name in 1991, Naughty Dog released their first console game, Rings of Power, in 1992. In 1994, Naughty Dog released Way of the Warrior for the 3DO, and it was published by Universal Interactive Studios. Alongside publishing the game, Universal also agreed to a 3-game contract with the developer and gave them space on their studio lot to expand. Naughty Dog co-founders Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin moved the small developer across the country to Los Angeles. Along the way, the two of them began creating concepts for what they would call Sonic's Ass Game, based on the idea that a 3D camera in a platformer would always be directed toward the characters behind. The concept came about as the two discussed the shifting of genres from 2D sprite-based gameplay to polygonal 3D gameplay. The two continued to redefine the concepts for their game as they traveled across the country. When they were settled into their new offices, they presented the idea to Mark Cerny, then Vice President of Universal Interactive. Cerny liked the idea of the title and gave the go-ahead for Naughty Dog to begin development. Dissatisfied with the higher-end consoles on the market, Naughty Dog looked to Sony's upcoming PlayStation console to develop their platformer for. By the end of 1994, Naughty Dog had signed on to create games for the PlayStation, and they purchased a development kit from Sony to begin their work. The development team for the new title grew over 1995. The team looked to Sonic the Hedgehog as inspiration, as they used a cartoonish marsupial as the new game's mascot. Naughty Dog even created a demo reel of the game and presented it to Sony, who agreed to help publish the title. The project was given its final name in the lead-up of E3 1996, when the team finally landed on Crash Bandicoot. Internally, fights between Universal and Naughty Dog almost caused the game to be pulled from the show, but it still made its premiere at E3 1996. Crash Bandicoot was featured heavily during both Sony's press conference and on the showroom floor. When walking into the Sony section of the showroom, E3 attendees were greeted with a massive replica.
You are walking closely.
Before it became a household name. Back then, it was just a no-go. The Sony execs were like, we're a naughty toy company, and we are not going to get into this business. Before it dominated the world of gaming, Sega had managed to capture 52% of the market in both Europe and the United States. It was only an underdog, brought up by a man with a vision.
Kenya's, I guess you
Before it became a household name. Back then, it was just a no-go. The Sony execs were like, we're a naughty toy company, and we are not going to get into this business. Before it dominated the world of gaming, Sega had managed to capture 52% of the market in both Europe and the United States. It was only an underdog, brought up by a man with a vision.
Kenya's, I guess you
is the vice president of Sony Records.
Sony revolutionized the industry with that simple. This is the history of the PlayStation. In the aftermath of World War II, a company named Sony helps the people of Japan rebuild from the ashes. Sony is a classic post-World War II success story in Japan. They started making cassette recording machines. They created a small cassette player that played back and recorded stuff off the bat, and that was the beginning of Sony Electronics. Innovative products such as the Walkman helped Sony become one of the most successful electronics companies in the world. Well, whenever people talk about Sony, a lot of people think about the Walkman. The Walkman was definitely Sony's first consumer product that really exploded. It was the portability of music, and everyone walked around with headphones. They really revolutionized the idea of portable music listening. As Sony gains more and more ground in the consumer electronics world, the video game industry grows by leaps and bounds. And by the early 1990s, the war for gamers' dollars is red hot. Sega and Nintendo are really dueling in the West. Sega had managed to capture 52% of the market in both Europe and the United States. Sega was more innovative at the time. They were always willing to take more chances. Sega was coming out with 70 to 80 games of its own per year. The strategy of Nintendo was, let's hold on to the next Miyamoto game. Nintendo pays close attention when Sega unveils its latest technological advancement. So Sega came out with the Sega CD. All of a sudden, games were going to be huge. They could be 600 megabytes. Nintendo turns to Sony. Nintendo wanted a partner, so they went to Sony, which of course was a huge, successful company. Sony may not have been a video game company per se, but the Super NES used the Sony stereo chip for its sound. Sony was certainly, in its own way, a player in the video game industry in a small way. So it was a race. Nintendo knew that CD-ROM technology was the way to go.
And the original concept was a peripheral CD drive
for the Super Nintendo that would be sold by Nintendo, and a combined unit which would be called PlayStation, which was the console and the CD drive together, which would be sold by Sony.
Sony brought in an engineer named Ken Kutaragi.
Well, when you talk about the PlayStation, you just have to talk about Ken Kutaragi, who is considered the father of PlayStation. He came in to Sony in 1975. Right off the bat, he was considered to be kind of a brash engineer. He was very feisty and had a lot of ideas. He struck me immediately as a very forceful character. He had a clarity of thought and insight, which I think was, I still think to this day, is very rare. He clearly is a visionary.
Very dynamic, very energetic.
Ideas and very creative. He's known to be a fantastic engineer and brilliant person on the engineering and technical side, but that's just happening.
And that Ken Kutaragi was, it was not like we were looking at an executive who was buttoned up. We were looking at a guy who was in the trench, who was clearly an engineering mind and was resolving problems. He's an impressive mind and he's achieved impressive things.
The idea of working on a video game console is nothing new to Kutaragi.
He was thinking about making a 3D game console a long time ago while people were tinkering away on 8-bit gaming. He approached Norio Oga, who was then president of Sony, and said that we should get into the video game industry. But back then, it was just a no-go. Olga and the Sony execs were like, we are not a toy company, and we are not going to get into this business. So that was that.
But now, things are different. Hand in hand, Ken Kutaragi and the people at Nintendo team up to bring Sega to its knees. But Sony is about to face a bitter betrayal that will change the course of gaming history. Sega prepares its new CD-ROM expansion for the Genesis. Nintendo and Sony work on a CD-ROM system of their own. But Nintendo begins to have second thoughts.
The big reason why Nintendo kind of balked on the Sony technology idea was that they weren't going to have any rights to the CD technology. Sony was going to retain all the making of the CDs, they were going to manufacture it, distribute it, and that totally cut Nintendo out of the picture on definitely a large profit margin.
And that made Nintendo very, very nervous. So in the forefront, Nintendo's telling Sony everything's great. But behind the scenes, Nintendo went to Philips and said, why don't you start working on something for us?
Nintendo's insecurities lead to a dramatic climax in 1991.
CES comes around, and Ken Kutaragi and Sony come out, and they announce the Nintendo PlayStation, because they don't know anything's going on.
Nintendo made a sudden announcement and said, well, we're going to work with Philips on the CD technology. That didn't go very well with Sony execs, and Ken Kutaragi was definitely very bummed. He went into Norio Oga's office and said, we just got backstabbed, blindsided by Nintendo. We had an agreement and they totally betrayed us.
Kutaragi went back to his bosses and said, let's not leave it like this. We can make an actual game system. We won't stop with the CD-ROM, we'll build a whole system.
And Olga, who was totally dead set against it before, now feeling the betrayal from Nintendo and being the semi-corporate guy that he is, said, that's it. Pounding his fist on the desk, said two famous words, do it. And that was the beginning of the Sony PlayStation.
Now, more driven than ever, Ken Kutaragi and Sony set out to make a video game console unlike any other. At first, Sony plans to release a system that plays both CD-ROMs and Super Nintendo cartridges. In 1992, 200 units of this PlayStation were manufactured, but are quickly scrapped. Sony decides to wait for the next wave of consoles to enter the fray, and intends to capitalize on CD-ROM technology.
There was a big change taking place in terms of media, game media like cartridges, CD-ROMs. This really changed the finances behind game development and game publishing.
In October 1993, Sony announces that it's working on a new 32-bit game console. The name of this new system is the PlayStation X, or PSX. The CPU for this console will be designed by Ken Kutaragi himself. On November 16th, the company officially forms Sony Computer Entertainment.
We formed Sony Computer Entertainment Inc. as a company, as a joint venture between Sony Corp and Sony Music Japan.
This new department raises more than a few eyebrows.
When PlayStation was being mentioned here in the US, people were saying, can Sony deliver games? Could they really enter the hardware side?
To some people within Sony, PlayStation represented the future and was very exciting, but to other people it was definitely a threat and something that they didn't fully understand.
We had a lot of people that were pretty much skeptical about us getting into the business. Even before we came out, we were pretty much placed in the failure column because we were just newcomers.
I remember having dinner with the vice president of Sony Records, and he told me, the PlayStation's never gonna work. Sony's gonna lose on this.
The irony for all of us was that as much credibility as Sony had in as a brand, we had zero credibility as far as the world of games was concerned.
Sony, I think, corporately was a little discouraged. How do we get into this new charted area?
Sony knows that the road ahead won't be easy, but Ken Kutaragi has an ace up his sleeve that will dazzle the entire game industry. As Sony Computer Entertainment goes full bore into the development of the PlayStation, it becomes clear that this will be a console unlike any other.
The biggest feature of PlayStation was going to be the real-time 3D graphics technology.
At the time, the PlayStation was a faster console than anything else in the market. You could push more polygons, it gave developers a larger toolbox to work with than any of the competing consoles. And of course, it used CD-ROMs.
After watching the failure of systems like the 3DO very closely, Sony realizes that processing power alone isn't enough to come out on top in the world of video games.
We looked at the business models of all of the companies that had been in the space or tried to get into space, and we asked ourselves, could we do this better?
The biggest problem that we had was the market in 1993 was dominated by Sega and Nintendo. They pretty much had it sewn up between them. So any new entrant into the market had to do something pretty dramatic and pretty special.
Sure, we had the system, sure we had the hardware, but that doesn't mean anything unless you have games. Nintendo already had Miyamoto, and he was a genius. Sega, they already had their arcade games, but Sony, what do they have? They don't have a genius developer or arcade games they're making, so they had to find software somewhere.
We knew that in order to be successful, we had to capture the hearts and minds of the developers and the publishers equally.
So what they did was they went on a very aggressive campaign to all the developers. At first, a lot of developers were dead set against it, mainly because it was high technology, it was 3D, and a lot of game companies were still making 2D games. And they said, that's going to be so expensive to make 3D games, no way we can afford it, and it's going to be very hard.
Fight one, ready, go!
one game that changed it and helped Sony, ironically, was Virtua Fighter.
Sega announced Virtua Fighter for the first time, and that completely opened up eyes of other publishers that showed that 3D graphics can be applied to other types of games.
All of a sudden, it was a leap. I couldn't keep up enough of the companies that were coming to us. They were asking us, can we do this? Is it possible to do this? Everybody wanted to work on the system.
Sony does everything it can to round up third-party developers to support the PlayStation and is able to sign 250 in Japan alone.
The first task for me was managing the third-party departments to recruit and help support third parties like Namco. My target was to get as many publishers and many popular title franchises to become available on PlayStation.
Sony also spends $48 million to purchase Psygnosis, the European developer behind Limits, and changes its name to Sony Interactive Entertainment. In December of 1994, Sony releases the PlayStation, now without an X, in Japan.
The success in Japan was almost instantaneous. Another 3 months to get to the million mark in Japan. And I remember the then chairman of Nintendo saying that if we ever got to 1 million units, he would resign because he clearly knew nothing about the games business. It took him a few more years to actually get around to it, but I thought it was a great statement.
The next step is ensuring a successful launch in the US and Europe. To pull this off, Sony spares no expense. The Japanese giant spends a rumored $4 million for a booth at E3 in 1995. Sony also kicks off a huge marketing blitz to raise awareness for the PlayStation.
The marketing strategy was very clearly defined from the beginning that we needed to appeal to an older, more sophisticated audience. We also had a very smart bunch of people in our marketing department who recognized that everybody really wants to be 19. If you're 12, you want to be 19. If you're 25, you really want to be 19 again. And so what they did was they targeted 19 as the communication tone of voice.
Another thing that I think was really key to establishing that credibility for us was the idea that gamers wanted to work a bit harder at deciphering messages, teasing a date like 9/9/95, playing with Enos, which was essentially Sony spelled backwards.
Sony was saying games are a lifestyle, and we're going to promote and work it from a lifestyle perspective.
We very deliberately stayed away from making sort of wide Sony brand a big part of the communications message. The initial tagline of "You are not ready" was the first big step that we took in saying, this is not your parents' Sony brand.
With this new mindset, Sony sets out to conquer the United States. After a nationwide marketing blitz unlike any other, Sony launches the PlayStation in the United States on September 9, 1995.
The first day, September 9th, I felt really like, oh, we did it. But it was like really one of the numbers in the first year. It's like only 800,000 units.
The initial launch of the PlayStation was a real happy day for me. It just was overwhelming. For a relatively unknown company, at least in the video game business, to get that kind of enthusiasm from day one. The original PlayStation, I think, really touched a nerve. I think that part of that was down to the product itself. It's a great hardware device, and they wound up some great software. And I'd like to think we did some nice marketing.
The controller of the PlayStation it's unbelievable. It's just perfect.
The PlayStation picks up more and more sales thanks to powerful hardware and a collection of exclusive games and other hits.
We had Ridge Racers of driving. So we had a driving game, and then I wanted a fighting game. So I went out and hunted for that. Not pushing. And if you look at the sexiness and the appeal of the pushing that it was about as a fighting game, it was fabulous. It was a major, major hit. In 1996, we came out and launched Crash Bandicoot. Crash Bandicoot was a terrific launch title. Defined PlayStation's platform.
And it was about a year or so after the launch of PlayStation, some executive at Squaresoft said he's gonna make Final Fantasy on PlayStation. At that point, I felt that all the tides will change.
The PlayStation proves to be a juggernaut that plows through all competition.
Sega launched before PlayStation in 1995, which was the wrong time to launch. Also a very expensive price point. I believe it launched at $399 versus $299. The PlayStation launched. It did not have very good games.
But it was around Thanksgiving and going into the holiday of 1995 where we started getting reports that the retailers were just not going to have enough PlayStation units to last them through the holiday selling season. It really turned into a feeding frenzy.
The success of the PlayStation goes beyond even Sony's expectations.
Eventually, the success of the PS2 kind of like brought the PS1 era to a close, but you can still walk into Toys R Us and buy PS1 games.
The PlayStation has changed the world of gaming as we know it.
Sony had not brought hardware to the video game industry. I think the industry would be a lot smaller than it is right now. Before the original PlayStation came out, the media perception of the video game business was that it's basically a toy for kids. But we saw the PlayStation as not really a platform of entertainment for kids, but really an interactive entertainment platform for everybody.
Sony revolutionized the industry with the PlayStation. It's that simple. They started off as an underdog, and in 10 years, they managed to own over half the market. And that's just incredible.
There are now over 35 million PlayStation 1 machines in the US and Canada combined, which puts us at an unbelievable household penetration rate compared to other game systems. And I think for many consumers, PlayStation equals gaming.
Today, Sony remains number one. The PlayStation successor, the PlayStation 2, has shipped more than 90 million units worldwide and is still going strong. Sony is moving into the portable gaming market with the PSP, while the next generation PlayStation 3 is just around the corner.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to the father of the PlayStation, Ken Kuragi.
And the man that started it all is still at the helm, ready for the next challenge.
And now, I have the final and the biggest announcement.
Ken Kuragi's a man who has like years in advance plotted out in his head and has an amazing vision of where he wants video games to go.
Ken is the new father of PlayStation.
I always believed PlayStation would be number one.
Hindi komportable kumain pag maluwag ang pustiso? Mag-Polydent Adhesive para sa long-lasting, strong kapit at all-day gum comfort with Polydent Adhesive's triple action benefits. Ma-e-enjoy mo na ang lahat ng paborito mong pagkain. Hindi pa na nagsabi, mag-Polydent palagi.
The Whopper just got better.
What the fluff? What the flavor? What the flavor?
The better than ever Whopper still starts at $79.
During the third and fourth generation of consoles, the market was dominated by two companies, Nintendo and Sega, as they had managed to build a loyal user base throughout the 8 and 16-bit era of games. However, the home console market was about to undergo a massive shift, as the next generation would be the first built from the ground up for true 3D gaming. And during this industry-wide transition, a new contender was preparing to throw their hat into the ring with their own brand new console, the PlayStation, created by the tech giant Sony, who after being burned by both Nintendo and Sega, wanted to show the industry how much they had been underestimated. However, no one could have predicted just how successful the PlayStation would become, and ultimately how it would change the games industry forever. During the fourth generation of consoles, Nintendo and Sega were competing for market dominance, after both their 16-bit machines managed to sell successfully. However, there was a bitter debate amongst gamers about which console was superior. The Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis as it's known in America, touted a faster CPU clock speed as one of its unique selling points. However, while the Super Nintendo CPU was slower, it had a host of other features to help it stand apart from the competition. Its higher resolution, wider color range, Super FX chip, and Mode 7 graphics scaler all made a good case for Nintendo's superiority. However, there was one area where Nintendo's lead was irrefutable: its sound. The earlier generation of consoles had gotten by with more basic audio processing. However, when the 16-bit generation came around, Nintendo sounded generations ahead of Sega. The Mega Drive had its own distinctive sound, which was a bit more tinny and harsh when compared to the smooth dynamic sounds of the Super Nintendo, which had 8 times the audio RAM and 2 extra channels when compared to the Mega Drive. This was all thanks to the SMP chip, designed and produced by Sony, but more specifically by Ken Kutaragi, who worked in Sony's research and development labs. Kutaragi was responsible for Sony and Nintendo forming this working relationship, as he saw the potential of the medium and jumped at the chance to work with Nintendo, despite the fact that Sony was keen to stay out of the games industry. Sony was well known for creating high-end consumer electronics, such as televisions, radios, home stereos, and the innovative personal cassette player, the Walkman. Sony feared that working on a games console could damage their reputation, as the games industry was still relatively new and many saw it as a children's toy and a passing fad. Sony's aversion to gaming was so strong that Kutaragi allegedly brokered the deal and developed the chip in secret, and when his superiors discovered what he'd been working on, they were furious. However, Kutaragi convinced them to allow the deal to continue, as a good working relationship with the games companies such as Nintendo could be useful in the future, and Nintendo had been very impressed with their work so far. So the two companies struck a deal. Nintendo would use Sony's audio chip, and Sony would be able to develop a disc-based add-on for the Super Nintendo, dubbed the SNES CD, similar in concept to the Famicom Disk System, previously produced by Nintendo. In addition to the add-on, Sony would also be allowed to produce a standalone console that would be compatible with Super Nintendo cartridges and also be able to play compact discs, a format that Sony had co-created with Philips in 1982 that offered much greater storage capacity and higher fidelity audio. This standalone console was dubbed the PlayStation and would serve as a starting point for Sony entering into the gaming industry. Kutaragi wanted to expand Nintendo's popular Super Nintendo console with a CD drive add-on, boosting the system with significant processing power and speed, as well as superior sound and storage. After the launch of the Super Nintendo, development on the SNES CD and the PlayStation began. However, during negotiations, friction between Nintendo and Sony started to